The national response to the United States entering World War I was chaotic and nationalism was rampant. This was due to Germany breaking the Sussex Pledge, which was the promise Germany made to the United States in 1916 that stated they would not perform unrestricted submarine warfare.
But small southern towns did not all get this urge of nationalism. This can be seen in Greenwood, South Carolina, a county of about 463 square miles. Greenwood did not express strong feelings in response to World War I. Their main focus was the financial motive behind the war and how it would affect the city's economy. The focus of Greenwood's journalism was on more local matters, such as church meetings, deaths in the town, and small business advertisements.
Whereas larger communities like Greenville, Columbia, and Charleston had headlines and stories relating to national events alongside local news. This makes Greenwood more locally focused rather than having national stories. Therefore, people in Greenwood were not as affected about the war because of the lack of journalistic attention. As an example, you can see this journalistic difference when looking at the Greenville News and the Greenwood Daily Journal.
When the United States entered World War I on April 6, 1917, both areas took this news differently. The Greenville News talked about the war proclamation and indirectly talked about the Selective Service Act. There is a whole page dedicated to the war and not just America's involvement, but even more spread out news, like being concerned with Cuba and Mexico's involvement in the war. Greenville News includes all perspectives, and on their front page, almost all of the stories and headlines are national news of the war.
In contrast, Greenwood does have similar national headlines about the war, but the reports are smaller and lack the amount of detail that Greenville News has. Local news, advertisements, and entertainment take up more of the pages than national news. From this, we can infer that the editors and contributors may have felt that local news was more important, or that the people of Greenwood were more concerned about local news rather than national.
The war put financial strain on industries in America, and Greenwood especially felt this pressure. Dispensaries closed and were not willing to be reopened until the end of the war. But the lumber industry was predicted to increase by the end of the war, and unfortunately, cotton prices dropped due to Great Britain putting a naval blockade into effect to beat Germany. The drop in cotton affected Greenwood and other southern cities because it did not bring in enough money for people to pay back loans and pay bills, and it changed the southern lifestyle. Even though the price of cotton affected trade, business, and farmers, the locals still stood strong. They would not let the cotton struggle bring them down, that there have been harder times, and if anything, it pushed them to work harder and fight for their businesses. Though the hard times that the war brought to Greenwood, this was not the end of the cotton struggle. They were suffering a depression brought on by the war in 1920. An excerpt from the Greenwood Index Journal from October 8, 1920 has this to say about the struggle.
Despite daily evidences of tight money, slackened trade, and depressed price of cotton, it is a fact that we are all here and that most of us are veterans of 1914, and any man or business that survived that memorable year can or ought to be able to stand this present struggle. Do you remember that year, that awful year of 1914? That was the year when we not only had the bottom to drop out of the price of cotton, but we had a short crop. This was the year of the Buy a Hole movement. That was the year when the East saw us standing, as we are reminded now, with our hats in our hands, begging for help. Did we get it? Got it in the neck. 10 cents cotton seemed a blessing, if it would only come, but it came with a laggard feet. Cotton was sold at 8 and 9 cents and lower for low grades. Some farmers made no more than 2 bales to the plow. Truly it looked as if the world was coming to an end along with the awful World War which was raging then. Values dropped. No one was worth much. If what anything would bring on the market was any standard of values. Blue was the word all along. The line and gloom was so thick you could cut it in chunks. To think of it is now like a nightmare. But it passed, and this too will pass. There were men in 1914 who had fought through 1893 and 1894 and 4 cents of cotton. They lived, and many of them afterwards prospered. There were a few who had lived through 1873 and remembered the horrors of its Black Friday. It's bad, this depression, but times been worse. Better times are coming someday. If you went through it in 1914, you will come through 1920. Make up your mind that you will, and you will.